You know, I've always been of the opinion that when working on a force for a war game, you take a little extra time on the leader. You try and push the quality of the painting as much as you can to get something that stands out. And because I stuck to this principle, my old boy Cornac here came out pretty decent. But there was one particular part of working on this, where I found myself having a bit of a think about how we communicate the painting process to each other. So I want to bring you along now with some slightly sped up footage but very little editing, that being the main point, showing how I painted this sword blade. Initially here I'm just setting up my palette, getting the colours I need for shadow, mid-tone, highlight, that kind of thing, getting them laid out. First actual step though in how I approach this sword is to kind of just throw paint at it. For my opening gambit, I like to chuck on some mid-tone, roughly where I think I'm going to want to start getting lighter. Very little skill, very little effort, just rough positioning. As I work away on this, you can actually almost see me pausing to have a think about where I want light, and then changing what I'm doing. Eventually I go into a lighter colour though and I start some more refined mapping. This is still mapping, it's not precise, it's a process of plopping paint on and seeing what looks good. When I'm starting to get an idea, that's when I'll finally commit to starting to push the brightness up and down where necessary. I like to build this up slowly though, using really thin transparent paint, almost as thin as a glaze consistency, but not quite that thin. Eventually, I'll start to consider texture as well, once I've got a bit of light established. Usually this just involves stabbing in some bright spots and dots, maybe some dashes, to introduce the idea of texture. Along something like a blade edge, this can be especially effective for conveying the visual message that it is a sharpened edge. As I continue to work up through brighter and brighter values, I'm continuing to push the light and shadow I've established, as well as the texture, and also starting to bring in some edge highlight. Most blades being made of metal, it's generally a smart idea to get a healthy amount of bright edge highlight in there to help suggest the shininess of that metal. Whilst I'm doing this, on a couple of occasions you'll also see me work on the spine of the blade. This is without a doubt the most miserable part of painting swords and knives, requiring absolute razor precision and exposing your slightest shakes. I tend to try to combat this by just approaching it with confidence though, in the understanding that if I do cock it up, I just need to go back with my shadow tones and tidy it up. It's not the end of the world. In fact, as I work on this piece, something you may have noticed is that it isn't a linear process, like we're often used to seeing in miniature painting. And this isn't something that's unique to blades. As a general rule in painting, I find it really important to try to remember that everything is correctable. No mistake you make will cost you anything more to fix than a bit of time. Now I'm getting into the really bright parts of my blade. You can see I'm edge highlighting with almost pure white. And in general, the highlights are working up towards completion. And it was at this point that my head started talking to me about how strange it is that we often view painting as so linear. This back and forth process of establishment and refinement feels so much more natural to me than something like base coat, then wash, then base coat again, then highlight. It feels so much more intuitive to just trust in your eyes and the delible nature of your paint and just play around until you like what you're seeing. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to keep this sword in focus the whole time I was painting it, and that leads me nicely to another point. Something they don't tell you in YouTube school is how hard it is to paint a mini from arm's length so that you don't get your head in the way of the camera. As I neared the end of this and was starting to put in the last details, I realised that I desperately needed to be closer to the mini, and the awkward angles I ended up holding it at were making it nigh on impossible to keep it in focus. All of this led me to realise another thing we maybe don't talk about enough. Sometimes you really do just need to get right on top of that bugger and work within a few inches of your eyeballs. I think watching YouTube painting videos, it can be so easy to think that it's a breeze to paint at arm's length, keep in perfect focus. This is exactly why you'll usually see quite heavily edited video here, and not more long form minimal editing like this, so that I can cut out the parts where I'm struggling to get close and comfortable without blocking the camera or ruining the focus. But the truth is, those struggles do exist, so we may as well talk about them. And whilst you might not be filming yourself like I am, I'd be willing to bet it could be worth spending some time just considering your comfort and your positioning. And maybe that's another thing that could, if not improve your painting, at least improve your enjoyment a little. I decided here to turn the overhead camera off whilst I touched up the last few parts and quickly did the underside. Mostly because of the reasons I've just mentioned, but also because it's just more of what you've already seen. So we're just the B-roll camera here. Now this is the far out shot, which I often use to edit into any gaps created by those bits of bad focus or head in the way moments. But back to this less intense angle now, let's try to put all of this a little more concisely. Painting for me, all of it, any process, should never really be linear unless it's absolutely necessary to the outcome. Now I'll be the first to admit that simple step-by-step processes are definitely easier to follow than, more whimsical back and forth ones. But the danger with the linear approach is that it can become so deterministic so easily. There's far less expression and creativity to be found in following the steps to a fixed outcome, as opposed to just having a vague idea of how and what you want to do and taking a little you time to experiment with how you'll get there. Old Gazarot here is probably not the best mini I've ever painted, but he's also probably up there with the better ones, and most importantly, he was really fun. And just in case you're wondering how that sword came out, here's another look after some satin varnish. So I hope you enjoyed this little unorthodox journey into my creative process and why it works for me. It might not be your cup of tea, it might not work nearly as well for you, but no matter what, I hope you took something away from it. I'd love to hear some comments from you about your interesting creative process quirks, and if you've got any like me that are a bit weird. Don't forget as well to give the video a like and maybe even sub the channel to help as we near that golden 10,000 sub milestone. Thank you so much for watching, folks, and I will see you all in the next one. So bye bye for now.